My name is Susie Penman. I'm here with my colleague Tandeka Dlamini. Today is April 7th, 2025, and we are here in New York City, and we are interviewing Dr. Eric Alterman. Can you begin by introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Alterman.
And tell me a little bit about how you met Walter LaFeber, when that was.
Well, it's kind of funny because I took this wonderful American History AP class when I was a junior in high school that was team taught by two teachers. One of them was named Werner Feig. He's a little bit famous as a high school teacher, and the other teacher was Judy Oxner. And Mr. Feig played the conservative, and Judy Oxner played the liberal. I don't know if Mr. Feig was actually conservative, but he played it. And he somehow got a hold of, maybe it was Walt's book on the Cold War, but he was always attacking this communist, Walter LaFeber, and his view of American history as a, exaggeration, as a joke, sort of, but playing the conservative. And that made me want to look him up, and I ended up studying with him, in part for that reason.
So knowing about him as a junior drew you to Cornell, or were there other things about Cornell, or was it primarily LaFeber's work there?
Well, in terms of the choices I had, that was it. Yeah.
And when did you get to first take a class with him?
Well, this is also kind of a cute story. Well, I took the first half of the survey class. What was that called? It had a name. Everyone remembers it. I would have remembered it a few days ago. But anyway, I think it was 311 and 312, but I may be wrong. I took the first half of that, the first semester of it. It's a 2-semester class. It's famously, hundreds of people in the class. Mm-hmm. And he would teach it on Saturday mornings to try and keep enrollment down really early on Saturday mornings. And I had a girlfriend who transferred to Cornell the second semester of sophomore year, just as I went to study in Israel that semester. And she's now my ex-wife actually, she recorded every class for me of that semester. So I was able to take the class even though I missed it, because I wanted to work with Walt when I got back as part of an independent study. And I needed to, I wanted to take his higher level class, his seminar, and also I wanted to do an independent study with him. So I took that class the second half of the semester without actually being there. I took it on cassette from my girlfriend's tapes.
And some of the other people we've interviewed have talked about his lecturing style. Can you tell us a little bit about your impressions of him as a lecturer?
Well, the most impressive thing about the lecture is the perfect timing. There were no notes. It was a performance. It was. I teach classes, but my classes are kind of haphazard, and I end when the time ends. I could keep going, but he had like a perfect script that ended exactly like the way you're supposed to write an essay is you're supposed to circle back to your original statement, and he would do that perfectly, just like with the last few minutes. So it was kind of a work of art, and it was good. I mean, they were good lectures. Some were great, and of course there's one that's probably been mentioned before, but where he would sing as Brooke Adams. Have you heard about that? Very few people give lectures on Brooks Adams. I don't think really anybody does. He was Henry Adams's brother. Mm. And Walt would imitate Brooks Adams brushing his teeth or combing his hair in the morning and singing, "Goddamn, goddamn, goddamn, goddamn." And he sang that to the class. That was his most memorable lecture for me.
What was his singing voice like?
I don't remember. It was like his talking voice.
Yeah. So what year were you when you took that class? Were you a sophomore or junior? Were you able to?
65 years old. Give me a break.
Were you able to keep taking classes with him?
Yeah, well, I did a year-long independent study with him. Mm. That led to my thesis, my honors thesis. and I took his class, his seminar on the history of U.S. foreign policy. So I took 3 more classes with him after those 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was it like to do the independent study with him?
Very demanding. Like I would find an important fact for my thesis, and he would say, no, you have to go to the original, this is not good enough. And that was annoying, but, the discipline was valuable.
Yeah. And what was it like to meet with them? I mean,
Well, I've never known anyone quite so formal. So it was very intimidating. And of course I was enormously impressed by his scholarship and his standing in the world of scholarship, and how much he seemed to know. So I've always been a pretty self-confident person when it comes to school. So I guess I would say, even though it was intimidating, I rose to the occasion of appearing not to be intimidated, although I probably was anyway.
And how have you interacted with his work over the years as an academic and as a journalist too?
Well, first of all, he's been very important to me in terms of, he was very important to me in terms that he would read my work and comment on it and give me and he blurbed 2 of my books. He blurbed my first book, and he blurbed the book that I published right before he died, which came out almost 30 years later. But I'll tell you, what was most interesting to me was when I wrote about him after he died in a column in The Nation. And I want to make it clear, I'm not comparing myself to Walt as a historian, but I found that I had, without knowing it, done the same thing that he did, which is that I've written now 13 books. And almost all of them did what Walt does, or do what Walt did, which is take a contemporary controversy and write the history of it. A lot of my books are that. That's what they are. They're saying, we're fighting about this, here's what you need to know about how we got here. And it wasn't until I wrote my sort of obituary for him in The Nation that I realized that that's where I learned it. So in that sense, my career is a tribute to his.
Do you know the extent to which, well, tell me a little bit about your relationship with him after you finished at Cornell. How did you keep in touch?
Mostly through, he would write, he's an amazing letter writer. He would write these really long, detailed letters. I saved them and I gave them to Frank, who's writing his biography. I was invited, I was very proud of this, I was invited to give the LaFeber Sylvie lecture at Cornell, which I did, and they had a party for me at his house. When I lived in Washington, we would have lunch if he was teaching. He would come usually every semester to teach the Cornell students in Washington, and sometimes in New York. But it was mostly epistolary. Is that the word? Epistolary?
Epistolary.
Yeah, it's mostly epistolary.
Yeah. And his letters were long. Can you tell me a little bit about what they were like?
They were long. They were a mixture of comments on my work, his opinions about politics, and then he would catch me up on Cornell, which, he was more interested in than I was.
Yeah. So how do you think that
I also we had a very nice time. I gave a second lecture there when I brought my daughter there, and he and my daughter and I all went out to lunch, and he wrote a letter to the admissions office for my daughter, which was not successful, but it was very nice.
Yeah. How do you think that he himself viewed his contribution to the field of U.S. foreign relations? What do you think he considered to be his most important contribution?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I don't know the answer to it.
Thank you.
I don't know the answer to it. I should have asked him that. On the one hand, the first thing I would say is, can you hear me? The first thing I would say is that it's through the students that he taught, who then went on to make U.S. foreign policy and become important commentators, except for the fact that a bunch of them turned out really badly. Some of them, helped create the Iraq War.
We won't name names.
And those are the ones he mentioned at the Beacon Theater, which really made me angry. Um, he gets credit. I don't know if this is true or not, but he gets credit for his Panama Canal book convincing Jimmy Carter or convincing senators to agree to the treaty. I don't know if that's ever been tested, like historically, if you can prove that or not. But what Walt did, which is unusual for a historian, it's not unique, but it's unusual, is that his books contributed to the discourse about a given issue and it gave people, which is what I tried to do with my work, it gave people a better idea of what they were actually arguing about and why it mattered and where it came from. That's what I mean by choosing a contemporary issue and going back into it. His book on Central America, I think, was very valuable in that respect. That's the one he was writing when I was an undergraduate with him. So I would say first and foremost through his students, but you can't know how that's going to turn out. But the scholarship, I mean, he was an impeccable scholar. He wasn't a bad writer, but he had no flair. He was very good at saying exactly what he wanted to say without trying to grab the reader. I remember that Central America book he told me had been rejected by its original publisher because it was insufficiently anecdotal. I remember him telling me that. So he wasn't one of those historians who writes beautifully. He just wrote clearly, and his research was impeccable. So his work was unimpeachable and not at all sensationalistic. And I don't know if actual senators read it, but staff were familiar with it. And it affected the historical profession quite a bit. I mean, no one in the historical profession has a bad word to say about Walter LaFeber. I'm sure you found that to be true. And it's because he was such a careful historian, and also people liked him.
I'm struck by the fact that he told you that about his book being rejected initially. Did he tell you that at the time?
Yes.
Was he fairly open about that kind of thing with the students or with people he?
I was not the students. We were friends.
Okay.
And he understood my ambition, so he was sharing with me not exactly as a colleague, but someone who understood what he was dealing with.
Yeah.
I mean, I was publishing articles in the press when I was still a student.
Yeah. Which of his works or ideas has influenced your own work the most?
Well, I have quoted that book on Central America over and over. There are things in that book that no one else has, with regard to U.S. foreign policy in Guatemala in particular, and also El Salvador. And I've written about that a lot because I write about presidential dishonesty. I've written 2 books about that. And so definitely that one. I suppose his view of the Cold War, he wrote, I think he had 10 editions of that Cold War book. And that book shaped how I understood the Cold War, which is how you understand so much else. It's a different view than most people have of the Cold War. It's much more focused on economics. It's almost Marxist. And I feel like it gave me a more sophisticated view of the Cold War than I would have otherwise had, that I mostly encountered in my life.
Speaking of Marxist, did you ever tell him your initial impressions of him when you were a high schooler?
I can't remember.
This communist LaFeber.
I can't.
So several of the people we've interviewed for this project they've noted that he wouldn't have enjoyed being labeled a scholar activist.
He was not an activist in any sense of the word.
Can you tell us?
He had no patience for activism. He didn't like those kind of people. He much preferred people in power and people in scholarship. But you would never see Walt LaFeber at a demonstration.
But what about through his scholarship? I mean, because some people have called him that, have referred to him as a scholar.
Only right-wingers would say that. No, it's true. Only right-wingers would say that because they think that, I'm guessing, because they think that anyone who takes a left-wing position on U.S. foreign policy is therefore an activist. Mm. But no, that's where his scholarship led him. And sometimes it would lead him to the right wing. I mentioned this at that conference. He really liked George Shultz, Secretary of State George Shultz, and I was shocked when I saw him on PBS saying how wonderful George Shultz was, because he shouldn't have liked George Shultz. George Shultz did a lot of terrible things. I mean, what George Shultz did was give Central America to Elliott Abrams so that he didn't have to deal with it. Like, he gave it to the far right, and he let them have it because he wanted to deal with the more important things. But that led to the United States enabling genocide in Guatemala, which Walter LaFeber wrote about as genocide in Guatemala. So he should have held Schultz responsible for that, but he didn't. He liked foreign policy practitioners who didn't get too excited, who didn't try to do too much. He didn't like Jimmy Carter at all. He didn't like his moralistic view of foreign policy. And he didn't like Ronald Reagan. But I remember he said to me that it was Jimmy Carter's fault that we got Ronald Reagan. So the last thing in the world I would call him is a scholar activist. I would call him a conservative before I would call him a small C conservative, in the sense that George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau were small C conservatives. Walter Lippmann, too.
Can you tell us a little bit about the dynamics of these conversations you would have with them? Would you push back?
Well, yeah, I was a Marxist, I thought. I went to the London School of Economics after I went to Tel Aviv University and then the London School of Economics. And then I came back, one semester in each. And coming back from LSE, I was a Marxist. I studied Marx and it made perfect sense to me. And there was a journal called Contemporary Marxism, and I would bring it to class and cite it. And he was amused by this. So I think he was just amused, I mean, I was smart and I cared a lot. Professors I'm bragging now a bit, but I was, I'm bragging about myself from nearly 50 years ago, but I was recruited by the CIA and by the State Department, and I pretended to go along with it. So I had a security clearance done, and then I subpoenaed it, and I got to read everything that everyone had said about me to the government, and my professors all said, he's the kind of student you always want because he really cares and he argues with you, and it can be a bit much, but that's why you go into this business, is to have students who care enough to, So I was like that. So he liked that. Most professors would. I like that too. And it can be a pain in the ass, but he had office hours, so it's not like I went to his house, and I didn't hold up signs. and I always, there were a lot of do you know the story about what he invited the ambassador, Salvadoran ambassador, to speak at Cornell during the war?
Can you tell us more?
And so at the height of the U.S. involvement in the war in El Salvador, he invited the Salvadoran ambassador to the United States to speak at Cornell, and it was a real shit show, if I'm allowed to say that. And a lot of students didn't want to let him speak, But Walt introduced him, and then when they were causing all the trouble, he got up there, and I stood up. I was in the front row, and I stood up, and I turned around, and I said, "Let the man speak. We're not in El Salvador, after all." And so I believed, I've always strongly believed, it's still one of my great causes in life, is in the free exchange of ideas, particularly in the university. And he, the story about him quitting the history department? Yeah, so even though he was considered a leftist, he was conservative when it came to protecting the university and defending its purpose. And I guess I've really inherited that. I wanted those students at Columbia expelled, because the university has to be able to function, and students do not have the right to prevent other students from fulfilling their own, getting their own education, no matter how strongly they feel about any given issue. So, I think I'm like Walt I don't know how much it has to do with it, but I'm like a leftist in the world, but I'm a conservative in the university.
And so when you would have these dialogues with them, it was...
I think it was a matter of him sort of tamping down my enthusiasm.
Yeah.
I think that's how I put it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was weird. Like most of my friends were on the faculty when I was an undergraduate. And I would play tennis with Dick Pollenberg, and I would have dinner and go to clubs with John and Jamie. But with Walt, it wasn't like that. It was much more formal. It was much more student professor. Like when Pollenberg died, I got together. It was during the pandemic, and I was like on a Zoom. And I was giving Pollenberg's, his family was on the Zoom, and I was saying something nice about Pollenberg, and I said I was a LaFeber student more than I was a Pollenberg student, and I said LaFeber was a great man, and Pollenberg was a great guy. And someone else said no, he was a great man also. But my point is that there was a real distance that I respected, to the degree that I respected anything in those days. Whereas I didn't have to feel that way with other professors. And like I said, there was this formalness to him. It had a lot to do with him not being, this is going to sound funny, but he's like the least Jewish person I had ever met in my life. And that created a distance. He was a real Protestant. I mean, I assume he was Protestant. I don't even know. Maybe he wasn't. But he had this Christian, it created this distance, this background that he had. Was not something I had any experience with or understood. And also he had, he wore a tie and jacket every day. And he did not, I did visit him once or twice at his home for some purpose, but it wasn't a social relationship the way I had with other professors. Isaac Kramnik was also a friend, in a way. I remember my thesis was on Jewish intellectuals. It became the book I just published 40 years later, 2 years ago. I began it with Walt, and Isaac was on the committee with me, and he says, "You're doing this with Walt LaFeber?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "He's not just a goy, he's a super goy." Which was true.
What impact do you see that he and his work have made in the discipline of history? But beyond that, you've worked for a journalist as a long time. So,
well, I'm not a traditional historian.
Yeah.
I teach in an English department, not in a history department. I have a PhD, but I got hired as a journalist more than as a historian. I don't know that I could get hired as a historian. I follow the history profession, but I'm not really in it. I would like to be, but I'm not really accepted in it either. I'm considered a journalist. So on occasion, I get invited to historical things, but I'm not really part of the fraternity. So I don't think I'm the best person to answer that question.
What about journalism? Do you feel like the question could be applied to his impact on journalism?
Well, you heard a lot about this when he died, about how important he was to certain people and so forth, but there's really no way to measure that. Sure. He wasn't the kind of historian who is also a journalist. He wasn't Arthur Schlesinger or Sean Williams.
Is there anything we haven't asked? Anything you want to talk about?
I'm glad you asked that. I always ask that question when I interview people. I don't do it very much, but I always ask that question. He was a hard guy to really know. I was surprised at the LaFeber Fest. I was seated with his family, with Sandy and his children, and I'm sure, I know for a fact that there were people there who were much closer personally than he was. Like I said, I always felt a certain. There are not that many people that it's definitely. I've been very lucky in my mentors. But most of the other mentors I've had, maybe I had them later in life, so I was more of a grown-up and I would drink with them. And, like the topic of sex never ever came up with Walter LaFeber, and I can't imagine it having done so. Like, I don't know what he really thought of me, you know? I know he liked, like I said, he liked having a student like me, and he cared about his students, and he wrote very nice blurbs for my books, and I was very proud of him. And that's like one of the reasons I'm proud of my work, is what Walt seemed to think of it. But we were so different, and the relationship was, as far as the relationships I've had in my life, so formal that I don't really know what he thought of me as a person. And that discomforts me a bit.
Anything else you want to add before we wrap?
No, I'm sure, like everyone you talk to, I feel very fortunate to have had the experience I had with him at that young age. That I mean, I would have had, other professors believed in me. Like I've been to Cornell, Yale, and Stanford. I've had very good professors, and again, they usually liked me. Some of them thought I was too much of a pain in the neck, but they always liked me because I really cared, But what Walt gave me at a very young age was a sense of the discipline, of not cutting corners, of doing the hard work, and I've spent my life sort of in three professions simultaneously. I was a journalist, I was an academic, and I also worked in think tanks. And I tried to adhere to the same standards in all of them, or at least not contradict the standards of scholarship when I did journalism and think tank work and so forth. And I had a discipline that other more successful journalists than me did not have. Like it slowed me down, but it made me prouder of my work. So I first learned that from Walt.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.